Well, I think first of all, it seems very clear that we're moving towards witnessing ever larger disasters, basically mega disasters turning up because of climate change, but also because of conflicts. And very often, it's not really, there's no clear distinction between the two. You have mega disasters caused by climate change occurring in particular in very fragile situations like Somalia, the drought in 2010, 2011. But I think what is also significant is that we have a growing number of smaller disasters affecting a lot of people, but getting very little attention by the international community. Secondly, I think there's a tendency to, well, basically that the international community does not seem very able in joining hands in stopping a number of in particular, the conflicts. Syria is one very, very good example, obviously, but there are lots of others. And one of the outcomes of that is a continuing rise in the number of areas that are basically inaccessible to humanitarian actors because of security issues, because of political obstruction, etc. I think it's probably true to say that today the number of areas to which humanitarian actors are unable to access is probably higher than ever before. But there's another trend also. I think it's clear that regional organizations are increasingly stepping in. We see that in South Sudan and we see it in West Africa. And I think also the Kampala Convention is a promising sign that regional organizations are really stepping up to this in a different way from what we've seen in the past. Well, basically, I think it has everything to do with the trends that we just talked about. But I think in terms of the opportunities, it's clear that the role of regional organizations and governments in the global South is becoming increasingly important, not only in terms of managing conflicts, but also in responding to humanitarian needs. But I think we need to recognize, there's a lot of talk about this, but in talking about this, I think we need to recognize that the regional organizations are primarily stepping up to the task in terms of natural disasters. Most of the time, the man-made conflicts are really left to the traditional actors, humanitarian actors, to deal with. Secondly, I think in terms of challenges, well, the humanitarian system is very clearly under heavy stress at the moment, and apparently not really capable in finding a way out. We've got turf wars going on between some of the most important actors, for instance, OCHA and UNHCR. And secondly, funding is clearly not able to keep up with the growing needs. This is likely to get worse given the scale of the present crisis situations. If we look at it right now, well, Syria is consuming a lot of resources, but even the funding status of Syria at the moment is not nearly as good as it was a year ago, if you compare it to the appeals. So it's actually quite worrying. And there are a number of other conflicts out there and a number of other humanitarian crisis situations where the funding is not really coming along as one could have hoped either. It's clear that change is needed if we are to face up to the current and the future challenges. But the question is really, what direction will those changes move in? I think it's entirely unclear. Many actors are talking about new donors for the moment. I think it's clear that as the economic balances and the power relations across the world are changing, clearly some new donors will pop up, and we do see some of those emerging amongst the BRIC countries, etc. But others may well decline in the same process. So some of the Western European donors, some of the traditional donors, might actually disappear over the course of the next 5-10 years. I think it's also fair to assume that regional organizations and governments in the global South will become more important as we go along. First and foremost, because they basically obtain the economic means and the capacity to act. But that's obviously really great, and it might even be the most important trend out there. But what that's going to mean for the traditional humanitarian actors, that really remains to be seen. Well, with a bit of luck, I've no doubt that the SWEAR project will continue to be a key actor in defining standards as a basis for accountability in the humanitarian sector or the humanitarian landscape at large, if you like. But a lot depends on how you position yourself as an organization, as a project. While I might be able to understand why you decided no longer to be part of the core humanitarian standards process, I still think it was a mistake. Personally, I do believe that the standards are key to defining the future for humanitarian action, in particular as we see new actors emerging in the global south, including in ways that do not necessarily correspond with the humanitarian principles. That is, if you look at, for instance, Turkey, the way Turkey operates in Somalia, well, clearly that is at odds with the way we would normally approach humanitarian principles. So, in other words, I think the standards play an incredibly important role in defining the future in this. For instance, also perhaps in providing the basis for a licensing system of sorts that can be used by governments in affected countries to the benefit of all of us. But to reach that stage will require the continuation of an inclusive and partnership-oriented approach by the accountability actors. And that has to be driven from within, not by donors or anybody else. So in many ways, I think it is really up to you to define the future role of the SWEAR project. It's certainly not up to me or donors in general, but I see some challenges, but I certainly also see some opportunities for you to really reassert yourself as one of the most important players in this field.